Still in here with Crazy Dad's Garage on the Crazy Dad Camaro. I'm going to do one specific video here about this two-piece drive shaft, and I'm just going to do it because I'm finding that we just tend to outsmart ourselves on the internet. There's a whole lot of information out there, and this is really good information. If so often we have this carrier bearing go bad on these things, and everybody's on the internet, everybody, everywhere, there is no resource for replacing that carrier bearing. And there's several reasons. First of all, because on a 4th gen Camaro, anything from, except the first year or two of a 3rd gen Camaro, Firebird, all the way through the 4th gen stuff, the drive shafts are the same. And so the one-piece drive shafts are the same. And they especially use the one-piecers in the V8s. And so from everything that I can find out there, if you've got the option, you want to, go out and find yourself a one-piece drive shaft. And if you're really looking, you'll probably find an aluminum one, which is the top of the line best one that you can get. And all those things are a direct bolt-in replacement for this drive shaft. And one of the reasons that nobody likes two-piece drive shafts for one thing. But there's some of us that run into situations where we need to know how to repair this two-piece drive shaft. Okay, so there's just some information that you need to know here about this thing. Chevrolet says that they won't even sell you the carrier bearing or the drive shaft support bearing. There's two different things that it's called. It's called a non-serviceable item, and that's just Chevrolet's attempt to sell you the whole drive shaft when the thing goes out, and they do sell them for like $800 or $900, I think. Just an insane thing. But you don't need to do that. If you're not concerned about 100% originality in your V6 car, which a lot of us don't really care about that kind of stuff, and you have the option, go get yourself a one-piecer and put it in. It eliminates the potential of this ever going bad again. Then you're just having, a potential U-joint on either end that could go bad, and that's about it. There's performance advantages that way. It's a lighter drive shaft, etc., etc. But they're just, okay, and so the other problem that we run into is everybody's finding that nobody stocks this carrier bearing. And I looked around all my local stores, AutoZone, O'Reilly, Napa, all of them, none of them seem to stock it. They all say out of stock on it. However, Rock Auto online does stock it. And I didn't look anywhere else, but there's probably other people who do. So then we're down to, okay, how do I replace this thing and make it work? Now, obviously, I've got this one all done, and I wasn't even going to make a video of it, but as I got to thinking about it, I'm like, no, wait a minute. People need to know that this can be done, and it's not that difficult. So here's how you go about doing it, and I'll kind of zoom in here a little closer to explain what I'm doing, okay? So the way you're traditionally supposed to get this carrier bearing off, the old one, is take this thing to a press and press it off of the thing. However, that's just a ridiculous waste of time and money. Get yourself, hopefully you have one. If you've got a grinder like this, get a thin cutoff wheel on it and go at an angle across here and just cut the thing on one side and then flip it 180 degrees and cut it again. You'll have to make multiple cuts to get all these pile of pieces off of there, but it comes right off. Be careful, you don't want to cut into the metal of the drive shaft itself, really. If you nick it, it's not the end of the world, but you can cut the outside housing off out here and pull it off. Then you can cut the rubber, and you might want to use a hacksaw or a knife to do that, or your grinder will do it too. But cut it, get those pieces off, and then you're down to the actual bearing itself down inside. And the bearing, the outside of it, the housing, you can cut it on one side, flip it over and cut another side, and it comes apart. Then all the ball bearings will fall out of the thing, and then you're left with just the center piece of the bearing, and just very carefully cut across it, rotate it 180 degrees, cut it again. And all of these things, if you just get yourself a nice big flat bladed screwdriver, you can pry them apart and with a hammer tap those pieces off of there, and bingo, you've got the thing off. Now comes the biggest problem that I encountered, and I looked and looked and looked and could not find anything anywhere on how to do this. But so let's get a picture here. So this piece of the drive shaft and this joint, which is attached to the rest of the drive shaft, separate right down in here, and you can probably barely see where the tip of that screwdriver is at, but they separate right there. And mine, like most of them will be, was fairly rusty, and that I had a hard, well, first off, I tried several different things to get that apart and couldn't get it to, but I could tell it was moving just like an eighth of an inch. I could get it to move back and forth, and so I'm like, there's got to be a way to get this apart. And I've done some carrier bearings on pickups, and this is really your biggest challenge. What I ended up doing, first of all, I took some WD-40 and sprayed that thing just as full as I could get it. And what you really want to do is tip it up this way so that WD-40 can run down into the splines and things that are down inside of that part of the drive shaft. So that would be your first thing. You fill it up with WD-40, wait a couple minutes to let it soak in there. Then I came over here, and this end of the drive shaft, I opened up my vise here, and I put the bottom of the yoke into the vise and clamped it down as hard as I could get it by hand, and that's all the handle I've got on it. But I got that in there so that I had some weight on this end of it to resist my hammer on the other end. And then I just took my hammer right here, and this is a fairly small sledgehammer. I don't know what the exact rating of it is, but I hit it right there, and I hit it once over on this side, and then I come over here and hit it on this side, and I think I only hit the thing 3 times before it popped apart and just came apart. And what it is, this has a real typical setup. You see this a lot on CV shafts on front axles of front wheel drive cars. So on this shaft here down at this end, you've got a series of splines all the way around the shaft, and then it's got one of those metal snap rings in a groove there. And those things are always really tough to get out when they're not lubricated well. And this thing here wasn't lubricated well. So, but those few taps with that hammer on that spot right here knocked that thing out of there, and now we're all set to go. And what that left me, the surface right here where the bearing presses onto, it was clean where the bearing was, but back on this end of it, it was really rusty, and I could tell I was going to get a lot of resistance trying to get that bearing on. As well as the splined end of this shaft that goes into there was quite rusty too. And so this is a specialty thing that I use all the time. I've got this wire wheel on my grinder, and just FYI, I've tried lots of different wire wheels, and these cheap gold ones that you get Lowe's or Home Depot or Ace Hardware, places like that, are by far the best at stripping rusty surfaces off. So I just took that, cleaned up the whole part of my drive shaft in here, both the inner part and the outer part. I cleaned them up real good, and then it's time to put that bearing back on. And so what I did with that is, I've still got these pieces separated, so I'm only dealing with this piece now. So I took this drive shaft and I stood it up on the yoke up here, so this yoke was flat on the floor. And I got myself an assistant, one of my kids, to hold this. And I set the carrier bearing onto there, and then got a big socket that would clear most of the way, and get where I can see it here. So I put that down onto the carrier bearing and drove it onto the shaft until the socket started hitting and wouldn't go anymore. And that got it going on there square. So I'm hitting a socket on the backside with a hammer to drive that on there. And then at that point, my socket wasn't big enough to go all the way over the shaft, and so I had this punch that's got a square end on it that's fairly narrow, and I just got that down in there, while my assistant's still holding it upright, and tapped around that thing. You know, I had to give it some pretty good smacks, but it only had to go another 1/4 inch or so. And it only took me about a minute to get that tapped all the way down to the shoulder back in here, and it stops. And at that point then you're ready to reassemble the thing. I greased up the shaft here that was going back inside, and then I also greased up the inside so that I was going to get it to where it would move good. And then, let's see, how did I do that? Oh, yeah, the other thing that you want to think about here is that there's this thing called, with a drive shaft, called being in phase. And what that means, you want your U-joints in phase on a drive shaft. So I've got this U-joint here sitting where it's perfectly flat on the floor across this way. And this one over here needs to go in and line up at the same thing. So this one is perfectly flat with the floor. And what I did is I just set these two things on the floor and put the two pieces of the shaft together and slid them in, and they slid right into the correct grooves that way, because if you're going to be out at all, you're going to be out a whole spline, which is going to be an obvious difference. But then I got those in, slid them together, and it didn't quite go all the way in because it has that little steel ring around it again. And so I just stood the whole drive shaft up on end and bounced it on the floor pretty hard a couple of times, and that popped it the rest of the way in there. And now we're ready to go. We've got this thing back together. We've replaced that center support bearing or carrier bearing, depending on what you want to call it there, and got her taken care of. And so now I've got this thing ready to go back in. I cleaned up the yoke on my wire wheel too, just get all the rust off of it, and I've got some Vaseline on it to lubricate it so it'll go back into the seal. I'm getting ready to put a new seal in the back of the transmission now, and we'll be ready to go. And so I've got this thing repaired. Like I said, the guys that are telling you to replace it with a one-piece shaft, they're not wrong. That's a really good solution, but there's others of us that need to know how to fix it this way, and it's important that we do that. And so I just want to get this video out there. Sorry I didn't take the pictures in progress so you could see it in detail, but hopefully that explanation, if you've got any mechanical experience at all, will give you the ability to replace that carrier bearing for yourself. So there you go. I think this is important that this video gets out there, because there's dozens of these cars, or hundreds of thousands of these cars on the road, and people need to know how to do this repair. So there you go. Another video from Crazy Dad's Garage right here in the middle of the Crazy Dad Camaro. Look us up and follow the rest of the build that we're doing. Talk to you later. Good luck with your car.